was going to be compelled to work in portraiture. But even back then, I was compelled to a certain type of portraiture. I'm looking back through early 19th century portraits, those sort of gauche, self-conscious stare back into the camera from those very early portraits, obviously dictated by the very slow shutter speeds back then. I was captured by this quiet, direct look back to the camera. Now this sort of gauche, self-conscious stare into the camera was sort of antithetical to normal notions of the portrait, and I quite liked that. And another convention of photographic portraitures is they seek out the celebrity subjects, and I had no intention of doing that. I knew I wanted to work with life around me, the people around me. So I didn't actually stay all that long at Param College. I was a bit of a troubled young man in my own ways, but I spent a year there, but one of the most important things was I became very close friends with a famous old Australian photographer, Athol Smith. And I used to visit Athol's little duplex apartment in South Yarra frequently. And I think I learnt my history of photography through Athol. We'd be sitting in this little courtyard of his thing. He had a big ceramic dish he used to use as an ashtray, and his coney coffee thing. And we'd sit there chatting about the history of photography, and he had bookshelves with many, many photographic books that he allowed me to look through and borrow. So he was invaluable in helping me move forward into the direction I want to go. So I started to photograph people around me, and within a year or two, I ended up having an exhibition, which I was fortunate enough to share with Carol Jerams at Brummell's Gallery. Brummell's Gallery was, and dear Rennie Ellis, people who know the history of photography will know of Rennie Ellis. I'm going to show you some of these images at Brummell's Gallery now, because you'll see there was a certain progression through the work that I did, that I showed there. That was heading towards a certain structure that I was going to put around my own sense of portraiture. Sorry, let me get used to this. Here we go. So these early portraits were more conventional in the sense that the people within their environments and the artistic interplay of background and subject. But as this work progressed, I started to want to move towards a more neutral background situation where I'm really just concentrating on the person themselves and that look back into the camera. As you'll see through all of this stuff, there's that direct look into the camera. But as I move further forward in this show, there's a progression towards this sort of neutral background. Now, in these early instances, this was just an artist stretcher with a bit of Hessian over it, toned to a certain tone, and I'd place the sitter in front of it and take the shot. So all this sort of led me to believe that what I really should be looking for is to see if I can find myself a studio, and preferably an old-fashioned studio with, old-fashioned daylight studio. I'd seen photographs of those wonderful studios from the 19th century in Europe, and I wanted to try and find something that just might be a little bit like that. I was also guided a little bit at the time by a couple of contemporary American photographers and the work they'd done. I was looking not only to take, I wasn't looking to take a photograph, a portrait of someone as the quintessent portrait of that person. I was looking more to work in a sort of essay form, if you like, where I take a series of portraits, and that series would be what I would be wanting to reflect rather than individual photographs of each particular person. Now, two famous American photographers influenced me a bit in this. There was an American photographer called Irving Penn, and he created a body of work and produced a wonderful little book called In a Small Room. In a Small Room was actually a small tent which he took all around the world to different exotic cultures and used that tent like a studio, once again with a very plain background. And he photographed different cultures. I remember some of the Berber Arabs from southern Morocco, Peru, some places in Africa. Of course, he had the advantage that all of this was sponsored by Vogue, but I was impressed with this neutral background and the use of diffuse daylight, which I was seeking to do, and the subject looking directly back into the camera. There was a particular shot of Penn's that I absolutely loved. It was a young Berber girl, for barely in her teens, if that, and she was standing there with a little lamb around her shoulders, with the hind legs in one hand and the forelegs in the other, and the little lamb draped around her shoulders with this little frowny look directly back into the camera. Such a beautiful image. So there was that, and there was also a body of work done by Richard Avedon, famous American photographer, once again using a plain white background, photographing a lot of celebrity people in New York. Now, with the arrogance of the young enthusiastic thing, I was critical in my own way of both these bodies of work. Avedon's, I thought, Avedon, you have to be photographing celebrity people. And he was shooting full frame and cramming the person up against the edge of the frame for effect. That annoyed me. With Irving Penn, although the work was very beautiful, sometimes I thought I was photographing some very nubile African women, and the way he drapes them all together was a bit too designer for me. So that's not to say that both these bodies of work weren't powerful bodies of work. That was just the arrogant young me working out where I was going to go in my own direction. So, as I said, from this Brummel's work, I set about looking for something that could be like a daylight studio. Now, at that time, like a lot of us, I wasn't just doing my photography. I was also working as an actor. I was involved in a fairly big production at the Pram Factory. And I was involved with a sort of a bit of a hard-edge breakaway group within the Pram Factory called Night Shift. That was more the sort of hard-edge junkie element of the Pram Factory. And they had taken over this loft in Fitzroy a year or so before, and they'd been using it for rehearsal and the odd performance. And at the end of the play that I was in was called Dreamers of the Absolute. What a wonderful title. So when Dreamers of the Absolute finished, Lindsay Smith, who'd been director of this piece of theatre, who was actually occupying the loft, was leaving to go back to New York. And so I had the opportunity of taking over that space. So that space is what was to become my studio. When I moved in, I knew I was in there for the long haul. That's 1978. The long haul was right. I'm still there 45 years later. So when I first moved in, it didn't quite look like this. But you can see it's one of those places with those, it's called lantern roofing, with those big square windows up top, so the place is beautifully flooded in daylight. So there I set about creating a series of portraits. Now, once again, I was going to be drawing from those around me, my friends, fellow photographers, actors, writers, performers, junkies, my peers. So slowly I started to build up this series of portraits of those friends around me. Carol was a very aloof creature that you'd occasionally see wandering down Brunswick Street. Now, Brunswick Street in those days was a very different place. It had only maybe one or two cafes at that stage, Baker's and Rumbarellas, you might remember, where you'd see Carol wafting aloofly into Rumbarellas, and she was like a vision. She also had a job as door bitch on a nightclub thing on Smith Street, and believe me, no one got past Carol. She didn't want to get into the club. So, another one of my friends, painter Robert Hunter. When I say I didn't want to seek out celebrity, some of my friends went on and became quite well known in their own sphere. Robert Hunter, a well-known Melbourne painter, a minimalist. Robert passed away a few years ago now, unfortunately. But after his death, he had quite a big retrospective show at the NGV of his white-on-white paintings. Now, in making these portraits, I'd set up a situation in my studio which was really restricting the amount that my sitters could do. I used a hardback kitchen chair. There's only one way to sit. And very happily was using a slow shutter speed, because then the particular skylight I was using dictated that, which harks back to the same as the 19th century. I really liked slowing the process down. I wasn't going to be seeking out spontaneity or projection or anything like that. I was paring things right back. So I was not only restricting the ability of my sitters to the way they sat, but also I was framing each one in exactly the same way. So quite a paring back of the process. Around that time, by sheer coincidence, there was an exhibition up at Melbourne University called The Suspect Image. This strange body of work had come in from Italy via Italian consul, I think. It was originally shown at the Australian Centre for Photography in Sydney. It was a collection of photographs and artefacts from the Cesare Lombroso Museum of Criminology in Turin. Now, Cesare Lombroso was a really well-known 19th century criminologist. And he was like a lot of other people at that time, using the theory of phrenology in creating these mugshots. Phrenology was that what we now see very much as a pseudoscience, although it was accepted back then in the 19th century across a broad section of society as being very real. That's where they were trying to say that you could detect personality traits by the shape of a human face or how far the eyes were apart and things like that. Quite a dubious sort of pseudoscience. So one of the things that sort of took me, though, at that time was this sort of, I realised, going back to the way I was restricting the photographs of my friends, that these portraits I was making of my friends, I'll just go back and we'll look at one of them. These portraits of my friends were becoming more quietly like mugshots. And I come to looking at these images from the Museum of Criminology, the 19th century, and I found it quite haunting that there was this quiet little parallel between what I was doing and what Lombroso was doing. So coming back to these images of Lombroso, forgive me, but I have to move in and concentrate here. So these early mugshots, Lombroso mugshots, were like hunting precursors to the portraits I was making. It's as if I was trying to deconstruct the mugshot. It's as if I was entering, but if I was entering the same space as Lombroso, it was for entirely different reasons. As Lombroso had done, I was severely restricting my sitters' ability to present themselves, to perform, but I was allowing them to be themselves. I realized at the time that I was being ruthless, but I wanted to be ruthless in a gentle way. This ruthless and gentle. I remember several years later, I was looking at a little bit more depth into the work of into the photographs of Walker Evans, those wonderful, powerful photographs he took of poor farmers in the Dust Belt Depression of the United States. And in reading further on that time, I saw that there was a writer friend of his at the time, forgive me, I'll have forgotten the writer's name, who described Walker Evans's portraits as cruel and tender. And I thought, cruel and tender, ruthless and gentle, we are talking quietly the same language. So why was I bearing portraiture back to this bare essence, producing images that were in no way trying to convey normal notions of inner character or expressions of individual personality traits, all the usual tropes for portraiture? By removing these constructs, the better to engage directly with the sitter, I was seeking to evoke anew something that had been diluted over time, something that had been obscured by familiarity and the sheer volume of imagery now available, namely that haunting spectre of time that lies quietly inherent in all photography itself. And time always hints at mortality. I remember Roland Barthes put out a wonderful little book, La Chambre Claire. In English it was called Camera Lucida. And in it, he speaks of that haunting spectre of mortality that lies within photography. Here we have Polly Papapetrou. Some of you may know her. She went on to become quite a renowned photographer in her own right. Sadly, Polly passed away several years ago. So it was quite a long, hard struggle for me to create this series. It ended up being about 30 photographs. Finally, it was exhibited here in Melbourne in United Artists Gallery with Anna then Weiss, now Anna Schwartz, and Luba Ballou. And then in 1986, I showed it in Poland, and then in 1987, I had a show of the work in Paris. In Poland, there was a strange reaction. There was this was Poland, 86, so it was still very much under the Jaruzelski regime, and life was tough. And I showed it in a small gallery in Krakow, and the Polish people were sort of screaming for Western freedom, and all things West were this idea of freedom and supermarkets full of food and everything, and I come along with these quietly direct, straight mugshots of people. So it was mildly confusing for them. And part of me wanted to warn them, as they looked like they, it was at a time of Solidarność, and there was a certain movement towards what was to become 2 or 3 years later. But part of me wanted to try and warn them that the West would come with its own set of problems, but you had to quietly not go there because the problems they were facing in their day-to-day life were so real that, you couldn't forewarn them of anything like I wanted to there. And then the following year in Paris, I had a strong, good reaction to the work because in France, they were well aware of some of the 19th century work that I looked at, that I was sort of using as a basis. So around that time was a difficult time for me in that in 1986, unexpectedly, I lost my mother. We had a weather eye on my father, who was living with emphysema, but it was my mother who died. And then I went off to Paris for the show, and while I was in Paris, a call came through that my father was dying. So I got around the world and back to my father's death. Within 18 months of that, I took up a residency. I was given a residency in a cancer ward here in Melbourne, in the Heidelberg Repad Hospital. So for 6 months, I worked alongside the palliative care team, working with people who were facing their own mortality and in a difficult circumstance, especially with my style of portraiture. I used the concept of time there, though, with some of the patients. I'd find photographs of themselves as children, and I'd reproduce that image and then come back and do a photograph of them, holding that photograph of themselves as a young person in front of themselves. Only a matter of weeks before they actually were to die. So, as I say, that was a haunting, difficult time for me, but an extremely rewarding time too. But I came away from that and the loss of my parents going, I think I need to take a break from photography. I also confess it was a time where postmodernism was being touted as the only way to go, and I wanted a bit more pluralism than that, shall we say, to put it mildly. So I thought I moved away, and that began a long break from photography. I actually went back to another love that I had, which I started to do a little bit in Europe, equestrian riding. So I went back to that, and another discipline of dressage and the involved disciplines therein. Another struggle too, because everything I choose is a struggle to make money out of or to survive doing. So another thing. But in going across, actually, it's no better way of getting through a series of grief than cantering your horse through a track in the forest on a rainy day with tears streaming down your face as you release some of the tensions that you've been going through. So my passion for horses was continue on for a long time, but I always knew I would come back to my shall we call it, my portrait pilgrimage. So come back I did in 1998. I created a series called Portraits from Last Century. Now, there was a young subculture that was obvious around me on Smith Street at the time. I called them the young ferals. I'll bring up the first image. They were coming to my area of Smith Street because opposite my studio was Friends of the Earth, and just down the way from me was the famous old health food store called Soul Food. And so they were congregating in the area, these beautiful young ferals. And one day I left my studio. You've got to remember that up until now, everyone I'd done a portrait of was someone I knew in some way or other, and they had some idea of my work. Now it was going to be a different process. I was going to be approaching strangers on the street. And I'm a sort of reticent, you might say, shy sort of person. And one day I left my studio and I was walking up to go to the photocopiers, and I passed a little table outside Soul Food, and there were 3 of these. I'll move on until I come to one of them. 3 of these feral beauties. Aurora was one of them. Meg was another. The 3 of them sitting there. I thought, this is exactly the sort of subjects I want for my series. And I wanted to make a transition into colour. Now, what more vibrant sense of colour can you have than these? So, as I'm going past these girls, I couldn't bring myself to stop and speak to them. Not only was I shy, I'm also a man of a certain age, and I'm approaching young women. So, a difficult situation. So I kept on walking, and I'm pressing myself as I walk up Smith Street, and I'm saying, go to the photocopiers, get done what you need to do, and walk back. And if they're still there, you must stop and talk to them. So I do that. I get up to the photocopiers, and the machine I wanted to use was out of action. I thought, oh, great. So I came back down Smith Street, walking. I saw them still sitting there, and what did I do? I walked past them again. And oh no! So I turned left into Smith Street. I turned left into Soul Food, and trying to gather my breath in there, and one of them walked in. So finally I managed to sort of go up to her and mumble my case and say, look, I'm not talking about today, I'm talking about sometime, another day, but look, my studio's nearby, if the 3 of you want to just pop in and have a look. So they did come to my studio. Unfortunately, my studio is such that you walk in there and you know I'm not some sort of sleaze. So they all agreed to come back. And it was, I had such a good time doing these portraits with these feral, they were the young eco warriors of the time. They were up protecting the forests from blocking. And so I'd only see them when they were congregating down in Melbourne. But I just loved the way they presented themselves, a rip here, a tear there, a bit of lace, a thing through the nose. They were, in fact, Meg said to me, she said, listen, I want to just check something. You don't have anything to do with fashion, do you? And I said, no, I don't. She said, well, you've got to be careful because fashion copies us, So I thought, fair point. So went on and finished that series. It ended up being called Portraits from Last Century because it took me quite a while it was about a decade before I actually exhibited the work. So at that stage I thought, that's a good title, I can call them. Like these were done in 1998. So a decade later I could say they were Portraits from Last Century because there is this sort of timelessness to some of them. Some of them looked quite medieval, some of them look quite tribal, But a lot of fun doing that series there. Unfortunately, I've lost contact with most of these people because they were passing through a lot of them. Then, 2004, I was lucky enough to win a major portrait prize, the Australian Photography Portrait Prize of the Archive of New South Wales. And these prizes are really great. Well, not because of what you gain, your reputation, that's a bit beside the point, but you do get some cash. And that money is very useful. And I'd had this long-term project that I wanted to come through, and I thought, I don't want to go straight into that project. I'm going to do another little series of those around me as a sort of a warm-up to coming back to the big project. So let me preface this by saying, when I first moved into my studio, the building was, of course, semi-industrial and classified as commercial semi-industrial, and there's no way you were ever allowed to reside there, not residential. Well, there's no way that struggling artists can afford to rent somewhere to live and rent a studio like that at the same time. So I lived there. And it was a cat and mouse game. I should be careful, I'm saying that in Fitzroy Town Hall. It was a cat and mouse game with all the local authorities. What have you got a bed in the corner for? Oh, sometimes I get a bit tired in the afternoon, have a little lie down. These ridiculous game we played. Anyhow, come to 2004, and those regulations had relaxed. And the old buildings like mine became a rabbit warren for another younger generation of young artists, performers, students. And I thought, this is a good opportunity. I created this new series, Portraits from My Village. It's the first time I used the expression from my village. But these were some of the young performers and some of the young people literally in the same building that I lived in. There was a factory thing out the back taken over by circus people. So these portraits. Gabby was a wonderful, she worked in a cafe over the road. Gabby is someone I have a deep respect for. I won't go into the reasons for that because I don't want to embarrass her, but dear Gabrielle. Spotted Charlie, he's been living in London for a long time now. Vanessa, puppeteer extraordinaire. Paul, dancer, circus performer. Claudia, rap dancer, musician. Same, Yannick, with Yannick. So, Portraits from My Village. As I said, it was a lead up to way back when I did the original series of Portrait. I was well aware of the possibility that that body of work would hold to create a time series. Now, I've been fascinated by Sue Ford's time series. Sue Ford was a wonderful photographer. I saw Sue Ford's time series for the first time in 1974 in Brummell's gallery. She'd photographed her friends 10 years apart and paired the images together. I thought my particular series of Portrait, especially with its sort of directness, with its formal structure, would potentially make a very interesting time series in its own right. And I thought, long back then, well, it's got to leave it. I need time. I need a lot of time. Initially, I wanted to do that time series after 10 years, but life was to intervene and that was not going to happen. Also, during that period, one of my subjects from the early series, a man called Peter, had died. And I really wanted to find a way to incorporate him and his passing into the time series. So it added another quiet dimension. So I'd be talking not just about time and the aging process, but also hinting at mortality itself. So bear with me here. I'm going to go back and struggle with a bit of reading from my text. Hopefully I'll do it a bit better than last time. So, okay, here we go. Let me concentrate here so I can read a little bit better. So it finally came to pass that during the year 2006, I made contact with many of the sitters from my original series and brought them back to my studio, placing them against the same wall and framing them in the same way. As I mentioned in my introduction to the original series of Portrait, the trace of time is inherent in photography. In pairing these portraits together, these two arrested moments of present, now past, separated by 2 decades in the continuum of these people's lives, I was bringing time very much to the fore. And yet, I'll start to show you some of these. Yeah, there's Uncle Jack. This 20-year time period between. Eddie used to be Noel Busby. And Noel Busby used to be part of the Busby Berkeleys, a wonderful performing group with the last laugh in the old days. Eddie has been living in Berlin for years. He's actually living with one of the women who was part of Fassbinder's theatre group. I really liked Eddie because sort of his little pistol here is sort of echoed in this other little thing there. Here we have Polly again, the very plaintive young Polly with the more sophisticated Polly now. Now, I'll just read the next bit before I show you this next one. So it brought time very much to the fore, and yet when I paired the original photograph of Peter, who I spoke to before, had passed away, with an empty wall, I was looking to the future, a future that awaits us all. In time, all of us must die. Sorry to let you into that little secret, but it's a fact. It's a secret that our modern contemporary youth working society likes to sort of quietly keep hidden, but it's a true fact. So here we are, here's Peter. There's Peter. So when there's a series of these along a wall, that empty wall echoes that question of mortality in all of this. And there seems to be a little bit of gender slippage here. There's not, that's just an appearance, but interesting nonetheless. So after that, we leap forward now to 2010 or thereabouts. At that time, there was a sort of influx of new students coming into international students coming into universities here in Melbourne, or into Australia, but here in Melbourne. And those initial numbers, a lot of them were not so much coming from China then, the initial numbers, a lot of them were coming from India. And I remember, unfortunately, there was some skirmishes started to happen up in the northern suburbs, which were a bit unpleasant in a way, where some people were, reacting badly to the influx of these large numbers of people coming in. So I thought, oh my God, I've got to do something quietly about this in a different way. So I set out to do a few portraits of some of these newcomers to my village. So, young Marianne. Girat, he was lovely. Portrait of Marianne, fortunately, was a finalist in a portrait prize. No, it was a finalist, I can't remember which now. Josephine Ulrich, I think. And Girat was a finalist in one of the National Photographic Portrait Prizes at the National Portrait Gallery, which was nice for him. I let him know that he was on up there in the National Portrait Gallery. And Sophie was a French girl, a lesbian girl. She used to busk along the river, and that was her busking outfit. And Sia, little Japanese boy, out here to learn English, to improve his English. He was living in student rooms somewhere in the city, and we ran into each other and asked could I take his portrait. And we sort of became friends. He liked roller skating, but he wasn't very good at it. So he'd roller skate out from the city to my studio, and sometimes at the bell would ring and he'd say, "Oh, Rod, no, gotta come out, oh, crashed." So I'd come up, rinse a bit more blood off his elbows and whatever. We became close friends, and before he left, he made me this beautiful little, he said, he started to make this little thing like Fitzroy Street Railway Station, but he changed it into Rod Station. And it was made, to this day, I don't know quite, it's like little clay white bricks. And it was beautiful sort of thing. And there was a little tiny door on the side, and there was a little man with a big moustache. It was Rod the station master. And he left me that present before he left. And we exchanged email addresses, but somehow or another there was some mistake in his email address. And to this day I regret the fact that there's no way I can find contact with him. So those were those. And then Torero. Torero has gone on to have quite a life as a performer in theatre and stuff like that. So that was that series there. So we'll go to the first one. Marlena in inverted commas. So, first up there's Marlena, who I met as an assistant in a local retro clothing store on Smith Street. Marlena dressed in a very colourful way, with often combining her vivid red hair with clothing in bright lime and greens and vivid yellows and the like. She came to my studio and made some portraits playing with this vivid sense of colour. The woman who actually owned the shop used to call her my Frutingo girl, which I thought was very funny. So one day when Milena was at my studio, one day she asked if I'd like to know about her other job, and went on to tell me that she was a working girl, a dominatrix, in a local brothel called the Detention Centre. It did exist, apparently, somewhere here in Fitzroy. So we decided to go on and do a photograph of her in her other work outfit, which was rather classy, I thought. Next comes Brother Patrick, ex-merchant marine, ex-alcoholic, and an artist, quite a good artist. He had a couple of works in the National Gallery Victoria collection. And he later went on to become a fully ordained Franciscan monk. The order allowed him to live away from the monastery, and he resided in one of the high-rise flats in Collingwood, and could be seen wandering the streets in his robes, doling out pastoral care to all and sundry. Dear Patrick. He used to visit me up in my studio. I think coming to my place, fellow artists allowed him leeway of talking about his art and complaining about the gallery not doing enough to sell him and that sort of thing. I thought, not so hot for a Franciscan monk, but I understand that we're all human. Then there's Rosa, the monumental Rosa, monumental like the women painted by Michelangelo. Rosa and her family, Sicilian in origin, run the Italian patisserie downstairs from my studio, and they've been an integral part of my life over these last 4.5 decades. Next comes my dear departed friend, Philip. Philip, writer, playwright, actor, junkie, ex-con, and storyteller extraordinaire. To see Philip with some young kids around him telling some wild story with his eyes almost popping out of his head and his false teeth popping in and out and the kids going, oh! He really was a storyteller extraordinaire. And then the next one, which is Dear Peter Blue Lips. Peter Blue Lips was a I'll go back to what I've written here. He was such a warm yet troubled soul. As Jack would put it, he was from the house for the, as my friend Jack would put it, he was from the house for the bewildered. But he was a lovely, warm creature. We actually had this quiet, fitting little funeral for Peter on Smith Street. The hearse was parked outside the Framers, one of the Framers on Smith Street, and in the front of the Framers, we held a little service for him. And one of the nicest people on Smith Street, and a very close friend of Peter Blue Lips, who did an awful lot of looking after him, was a guy called Paul Sullivan, who ran the pawnbroking shop. I think that's just indicative of the character of the street, that the pawnbroker should be such a caring person. And dear, Paul was shattered when Peter died. And so we had this little service in the Framers, and then the hearse was to just go down Smith Street. So Paul walked in front of the hearse for the block in front of his shop, almost like a sort of New Orleans funeral. And the social workers who looked after Peter a lot in his life were there and everything. Quite a moving little funeral in my village. So these people, well, they were the pillars of my village. This last series was a series I did in 2016. I was, once again, I returned to looking at a younger generation of people that were living and working in or passing through Smith Street, and I was really warmed by the fact that there was such a cultural, ethnic, gender diversity on the street if you sort it out. And so I wanted to set out to do another series where I looked at this. So here we have the series, Portrait from My Variegated Village. This was shown at the CCP in 2000, I can't remember, 2018, 17, somewhere there. So here we have, and really was diverse. Timony, Ash, Ace, Mustaf, Leela, James. They really were a diverse bunch. James, for example, lovely little gay guy who worked in one of the cafes over the road. He asked him where he's from, and he said, "My mother's from Glasgow, my father's from Barbados." And all of them, you know, sort of. The first one I showed you, Timely, mother from Chile, father from Sierra Leone. Leela, father from Italy, mother from Zambia. So a real melange. So, but all this was against the backdrop of the time where you had a horrible presidential election in America, and England was looking to leave the EU, and both of these were isolationist sort of things where otherness was being condemned. So I really liked that this area that I lived in and worked in was sort of celebrating and that diversity. So, all right, let me just quickly try and sum up here before we go on to quickly do the video I want to show you at the end. So, why these photographs that I took, this it's rather unusual, my body of work. It's sort of an artist who sticks to such a singular, obsessive, almost obsessive, singular vision over a life's work. It's rather unusual. So what was I attempting to do? I certainly wasn't attempting to portray the characters of Fitzroy and Collingwood around me. I was looking at different subcultures, and it will go on and be a bit of a record of the place and the time. But above that, I was looking to something else. I was placing these people quietly in front of my lens, hopefully allowing them to gently look into that lens with a certain equanimity. When you're going to use the word equanimity, I thought, I know what it means, but I just double check. So the other day I just quickly looked up in the dictionary on my computer. It said equanimity, calm and collected, especially in the face of some danger. I thought that's really appropriate for this, because I do try to allow my sitters to be calm and collected. And the danger is that they're there sitting, looking directly into a lens with no chance to perform. So I was trying to keep a certain purity to the work. So now when you look back, it's a fairly modest body of work in terms of volume. But I like to think, coming back to my studio here, I often think of my studio, and I often refer to it as my industrial cathedral, because it's got the volumes of a cathedral. And then I was thinking about each of these single, simple little images of these people that I've done over the years. And then I thought, it's be nice to think of each single portrait I took as a pure little bell ringing out from that cathedral. And so ultimately I'm quietly looking at, within that human self-consciousness, especially when you've got a room full of these photographs looking back at you, I'm reflecting not just on the question of portraiture, but on the question of our consciousness of being, in a way. So, as I said, for whom the bell tolls. So now I have to say the bell is tolling for my studio. It's due to be demolished. As some of you will know, the good news is a couple of days ago I got word from my real estate agent that they're giving me another 12 months. So I've got 12 more months in my big studio before it's demolished. Anyhow, to move on quickly, one of my subjects that I photographed a lot over the years is a very close friend, Jack Charles. I'll just show you some of these quickly. This last one is a portrait I took of him that won the National Portrait Prize in 2012. And so a few months before he died, the National Portrait Gallery got in touch with me and said, we'd like to get Uncle Jack to your place, and we'd like to come down and film a video of you and Uncle Jack talking, reflecting on the portrait done a decade ago, but also talking about your long-term friendship. So they came down and shot that video, and I'm so glad they did. So when, a few months after he died, they sent me a copy of this, and it's now posted up on their social media pages and everything. Thank you for being patient with me.